Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today, our special guest is Ken Bossong of the Sunday Campaign, and that's actually a different kind of a Sunday. It's two different words, and Ken is the executive director. And hey, Ken, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So it's a Sunday campaign. I guess it has something to do with the sun, like especially since this is a solar podcast.
Well, actually, the organization is named after an event that Dennis Hayes, one of the co-founders of Earth Day, created in 1978. And I had the opportunity to work with him on it. That was a nationwide series of events to promote solar and other renewables. It took place in May of 1978, May 30th, I think. And in years after that, I asked Dennis if he would mind if I stole the name and continue the work of the original Sunday program.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, we recently had somebody on the podcast that was working for the Earth Day Foundation, I think it's called.
That's correct, in DC.
Yeah, in DC, so that's pretty neat. And just by the way, if you wanted to go check out that podcast, that was with Aidan Sharon from earthday.org, and it was released on April 22nd. And Ken, do you know what April 22nd is?
That's the date of the original Earth Day in 1970.
Oh, you know a lot of things. Okay, great. And do you happen to know Aidan?
By name.
Okay.
I work with the organization, and Aidan's one of the people I've corresponded with, but we've never met face to face.
Okay, great. All right. That's pretty neat. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your campaign and how people can get involved.
Well, the Sunday Campaign, again, is an outgrowth of the program Dennis Hayes launched in 1978. We were incorporated as a separate entity in 1992. So we've been operating now for almost 35 years. We took a hiatus for 3 years when I was in Peace Corps as a volunteer, but otherwise have been working pretty steadily since then. Most of our work is working as the coordinator of a fairly large number of organizations. There are, I think by last count, about 150 organizations that we work with. And our mission is to mostly compile information from the government and other sources on the status and cost of renewable energy technologies, how they can meet energy needs in the future, how they can address climate change today, and why they are better alternatives to fossil fuels and nuclear power.
Great, great. Yeah, it's pretty neat how solar is getting lower and lower in price. And I'm sure you can remember, because you've been doing this for a while, how expensive it used to be and just how dramatically it changed. Like, so I think you go back to something like 2010. Of all the sources of electricity, it was the most expensive.
Correct. I would go back even further. My personal involvement in solar goes back to 1973.
Yeah, then it was 10 times more expensive than
Oh, a lot more than that. It was close to 100 times more expensive.
Yeah, 100 times.
And most of the solar then was for the space program, where cost considerations weren't a big factor.
Yeah, and so like a kilowatt hour is somewhere between, I don't know, usually between like 10 and 50 cents in the United States. And so a kilowatt hour from solar electricity back in those days, what, like $1,000?
That's probably ballpark, yes.
Uh-huh.
There were some random cheaper applications used on Earth, such as for remote radio stations, for example. In those cases, the prices were a little lower, but not by much. The real cost declines began, as you suggested, about 15 years ago. And now solar is the cheapest source of electricity compared to other sources. This is both in the United States and internationally.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the utilities to raise their prices to $1,000 a kilowatt hour, and then everybody will just have solar. So that'll be great for me. This is something that was kind of interesting. So I was on my heat spring class, and I was talking to somebody on the discussion board, which I answer every day. And I quoted something, and I was like, I asked AI to make sure that it was true. And I said, is this true? Solar is now the least expensive energy and the most of new energy production capacity in the world. And the AI said true to both. And so I thought that was kind of neat. And so it said, true, solar is the least expensive energy source of new energy, and also true, most new power capacity is solar. And it even, of course, the AI, that's Chat GPT, went into some details. And I hope that Chat GPT was not spending too much money on fossil fuels and saving their money and using solar energy to make those NVIDIA units make my answer. I don't want my answer to cause any smoke. So what kind of neat information do you have about electricity being, a lower cost and all that?
You basically summarized it well. And in the last, depending on the criteria you're using, in the past 10 years, solar and wind have become cost competitive with fossil fuels, particularly coal and natural gas, and certainly compared to nuclear power. In the past 5 years, it's been hands down, solar and wind are cheaper and becoming cheaper each year. There's no longer any question that whether you talk about decentralized or centralized applications, solar and wind are the best economic options available. And that's both in the United States and globally. So your AI data is absolutely directly on point. We passed the crossover point, maybe again, 4 or 5 years ago globally. And with a few exceptions in the United States, we passed it here at least 2 or 3 years ago.
Great. And I would also probably say that traditional energy, the non-solar and non-wind, so I don't pick on any one type and get anybody mad, but those sources of energy, they're not competitive. I know that there's talk like solar is less expensive than coal, whereas they're not going to build any coal plants, but the ones that were already built, it still was less expensive to keep shoveling coal into them. And I think now we're even at a point where it's better to just build a new solar plant than it is to even shovel coal into those coal plants.
Absolutely. As one example, within the past few days, the Trump administration has decided it wants to pressure the state of Michigan to continue operating an old coal plant that was slated for closure. And there's objection because, as you suggested, the cost to continue operating the plant, even though it's an existing plant, is more expensive than building new solar or wind capacity or investing in energy efficiency or investing in energy storage.
So just like no matter what, it doesn't make sense. Like even if you gave the coal plants people a 30% tax credit, it wouldn't work. Not that I'm suggesting that.
Well, I can't address the 30%. That's a fairly generous tax credit. But certainly in terms of the current state of the market, coal is definitely non-competitive. It looks competitive only if you're comparing it to nuclear power, which is worse. But right now, coal is definitely not competitive against solar and wind. That is also true for natural gas. And as I said, it's definitely not true for nuclear power.
And let's talk about just the cost competitiveness of nuclear power. What kind of information do you have about that?
Well, it depends on the plant you're talking about, but there's been no plant constructed in the United States that is cost competitive with today's solar and wind systems. The most recent plants that have come online were the 2 reactors that are part of the Vogtle plant in Georgia, and the electricity costs there compared to solar wind are considerably higher by at least 50%, maybe more, depending again on some assumptions. But the cost of older plants, especially those plants that are having their lives extended, the costs are much higher than solar and wind, and the cost figures that are being used by the government or by proponents of those plants usually don't take into account the cost for long-term nuclear waste storage or the cost for decommissioning those plants. And decommissioning a nuclear power plant, according to the best studies I've ever seen, is roughly equal to the cost of constructing a plant.
Wow.
So you're talking about costs that are not being factored into the cost when we compare current costs of nuclear versus solar and wind. If you take the full life cycle cost of nuclear power, it's vastly higher than solar and wind, and I've never seen a good side-by-side comparison, but I'm confident it would be multiple times higher.
Wow. Yeah, so just like from a financial standpoint, nuclear doesn't make sense, even if you didn't care about anything else. You're just looking at just like, I want to be, do what's financially feasible, and you weren't looking in climate or anything else like that. Well, I guess, that is one of the arguments for nuclear is climate.
Well, actually, sorry for the interruption. I would argue that it's actually a bad choice for climate. The construction time for a typical nuclear power plant is at least 10 years. At least that has been the experience past 40, 50 years. And it takes maybe between 6 months and 2 years to build a fairly large solar facility or a large wind power plant. If climate is, in fact, a issue that has to be addressed quickly, nuclear power can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting to me. Like a lot of people that are really diehard for nuclear power, and financially, I don't really understand that. And solar and wind, like you were saying, makes, just like a lot more sense. And especially in this fast moving world. And I shouldn't just say solar, wind and storage, because we need storage, because we have enough of solar and wind where it makes sense to need storage, and storage is going down a lot in price. And then, like, how long do you have to store nuclear waste before it's safe?
That's a very good question. There are estimates of half-life, but it depends on the radioactive material you're talking about. Under the worst of circumstances, you can talk about tens of thousands of years. Under the best of circumstances, some of the materials that have short half-lives, 30, 50, 100 years, but potentially longer than our expected lifetimes.
So tens of thousands of years. So like when the Sumerians and those people are out there inventing agriculture, it's still not safe to go into their nuclear waste?
Well, the way that I like to put it is there is no human-made construction in the world that has survived longer than the expected half-life of some nuclear radioactive materials. So the pyramids, for example, have been around for a shorter period of time than the time you would need to store radioactive materials to a point where they're no longer dangerous.
Wow. Okay. So should we care about our descendants in 10,000 years?
I think we should be concerned about dependence even for 100 years from now.
Yeah.
So yes, from a point of morality, I've argued, and this has been my work's focus for at least 50 years now, that we should not be expanding nuclear power, and there are better alternatives, because we have no right to leave the cost and the waste problems for future generations, and there's no need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting how it seems like some people don't care about future generations. But I think it's like, to me, it seems very important that after I'm gone, that this place and humanity and consciousness lasts for a long time. And it just seems that solar and wind and storage are, it's the way of the future. And using these older technologies and heating up, it's like with nuclear power, if you just think about it, it's like they get some kind of nuclear chain reaction of atoms changing their states, releasing energy because of, E equals MC squared. And they can't really control those reactions too well, because how do you turn it off? It doesn't really have an off switch. And that was like what happened in places like, like Fukushima and Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. It's like, where's the off switch? They get an earthquake, they get something. And then there's always some reason we're like, oh, we figured out how to make it safe now. Like, that's never going to happen again. But they said that in the first place. And then it happens again. And if you look at the nuclear power plants when they were building those, like Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, back then, solar and wind didn't make sense because it was so expensive, or, didn't make as much sense. But now, with all this technology where we could just put things up really quick. I was listening to some other podcasts. I like to just listen to people that I disagree with sometimes. And it was a podcast with a bunch of these tech bros that were like, MAGA people and stuff like that. And they were actually kind of upset that they were talking about not renewing the 30% tax credit for solar because they needed to have this energy online now, or as soon as possible, like very, very quick. And the only way that they could see that happening is with, all the energy that you could get by throwing a solar farm together really quick.
Well, that was my point earlier.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you're going to address climate change, as well as other issues such as the need for electricity for AI centers, data centers, nuclear can't do it, at least not in any kind of reasonable time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Solar and wind can. We have ample evidence that you can build a solar farm or wind farm fairly quickly once you get through all the necessary permits. But the actual construction is fairly straightforward, fairly simple, fairly low impact in terms of environmental issues. And as we've said, it's much lower cost.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It makes no sense to go nuclear under any circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. And then some people have this argument like, well, it's climate change. And then their other argument too has to do with energy storage. But now we have other ways of dealing with that. So like you have intermittent renewables, but you have lithium ion batteries. You have lithium ion batteries in your car. You can control loads differently. And long distance transmission, we need more of that. Like super high voltage or high voltage DC going across the country. It just makes a lot of sense. And then what's funny is there's people that are like, well, not in my backyard. But those same people probably don't want a coal plant or a nuclear plant in their backyard either. And we could just run some power lines across this country. And I think financially it would make a lot of sense. Or just, more storage.
Well, I would agree with you with the additional point that we do not necessarily need to only build large-scale centralized solar or wind facilities. In the case of solar, at least, there is the potential for decentralized systems that don't require large-scale transmission facilities to be built as well. And most people don't realize that about approximately 30% of our solar-generated electricity today in the U.S. is from decentralized systems. That is, systems on rooftops or community solar gardens.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is I was at Intersolar Europe, also known as the Smarter E, recently. And one of their keynote presentations, they were talking about how in Europe, about 2/3 of their solar is rooftop. And about 1/3 of the solar in the United States is rooftop. And I think, rooftop is very valuable because it's distributed. It's like you make it where you use it, and it reduces the amount of transmission that you need. And a lot of times people that are anti-solar, probably for some kind of business reason, are trying to say that, you put solar on your roof and you need more transmission, but it reduces what you need to take. And even if you are exporting, your neighbor needs it. It's not going to make it too far away from your house when you put solar on your roof. It's not like my whole city is going to need a transmission line to export power that's in any way comparable to my whole city having a transmission line already, or even 50 years ago, bringing power to me. It's when you do distributed power, it does the opposite to the grid, is it makes it so you need less transmission and distribution, not more.
And arguably, depending on location, you may also need less generation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the advantages of distributed solar coupled with storage, but even without storage, is you reduce the need for peak load generation, which is primarily natural gas in the United States. So if you have a larger investment in solar and storage, you reduce peak load generation by natural gas needs, and therefore you reduce the transmission associated with that.
Yeah, it's just pretty neat with all the technology, how we're doing things that, pretty much change the world, and how we've taken it from something that was not cost competitive at all, and we scale it up, and now it makes all these old traditional sources not cost competitive at all. What do you think about, speaking of taking a long time to build a power plant, the other type of nuclear that they're working on is fusion. It seems like really expensive and take a long time. And of course, it doesn't make the kind of nuclear waste that you would have with fission, which is the type of nuclear power that we have right now. Fusion is really good when it's 93 million miles away, like on the sun. But trying to duplicate what's happening on the sun just gets to be a little bit difficult here on Earth. And even if they really figure it out, it seems like it's going to take so much infrastructure and all these lasers and controlled ways to control this fusion. At least, actually with fusion, they can turn it off. Unlike with fission, it's like a chain reaction. Like with fusion, they can turn it off. And even to say what they can do, it's like it's not really happened yet, or they're just talking about world record is a few seconds or something like that, and really expensive. But what do you think about fusion?
I believe I wrote the first article that I authored about fusion 46 years ago.
Wow.
And I am, as a consequence, fond of saying that fusion is perhaps our most dependable energy source, because you can always depend on it not being commercially viable for at least another 10 or 15 years. And that was true 45 years ago, still true today. There's nothing even suggesting that fusion is a viable technology, certainly not economically, anytime in the near future. And my prediction is that as fusion possibly gets to the point where it's actually viable as a energy source, solar and wind again will become so cheap that it doesn't make any sense in terms of cost comparison.
Yeah, yeah. So fusion is a future technology that will always be a future technology, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think like it's kind of fascinating. Just that I'm fascinated by technology and things like that. But yeah, it seems pretty difficult to make it work. But at least it doesn't have things like nuclear waste. And then the reaction will stop like with an off switch. So that's another good thing that we have.
Well, on the waste issue, I think that could be debated. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on every nuclear fusion technology concept that has been floated. But while you may not generate the kinds of waste from nuclear fission, the natural structure that would be likely used in a fusion reactor still can become radioactive itself.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're not producing waste, you are producing not waste in the sense of something that has to be disposed of afterwards in a landfill or whatever, but you are producing a containment structure that can become radioactive. But again, there are different concepts for nuclear fusion, so others might suggest that there are technologies that could avoid that. I have not read anything to that effect, however.
Yep. So have you ever been to the sun?
Not yet.
I think what we could do for fusion is we can go to the sun and we could do some mining and then bring a little bit back.
It's an interesting concept. I'm not sure if the economics would work out.
Yeah. Somewhere at one time at a solar conference, somebody gave me a T-shirt that said like, "Let's go to the sun" or something like that, and had some pictures, some people walking on the sun. I always like funny T-shirts. And so, let's see, you said you were in the Peace Corps and you took a little break from what you were doing. And once again, how long ago did you start the Sunday campaign?
Well, the Sunday campaign itself was incorporated in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
The Sunday campaign, however, grew out of work I had been doing since 1973, which is when I graduated from college and came to Washington, D.C., and began working on energy policy issues for a nonprofit organization. And in subsequent years, I have worked for 4 different organizations, including for Ralph Nader, and directed his energy program for 8 years.
Great. So do you know Ralph Nader?
Yeah, I mean, yes, well,
Okay.
we stay in contact. I had the opportunity to be a guest on his weekly radio program.
Okay. Yeah, I remember, I think I voted for him a few times, but if I was in a swing state, I wouldn't have. But I would, I'd rather have had him win the election, but I didn't want the worst guy to win the election.
Well, I'm a Maryland resident, which is pretty solidly Democratic.
Uh-huh.
So like you, I felt comfortable voting for Ralph. But as much as I respect Ralph, had it been close in Maryland, I would have voted differently.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, in any presidential election in California, I don't think it's ever made a difference. It was so far off, like I could always vote for third party. And a lot of times I have voted for third party, but, hey, I wasn't in Florida where it was hanging by a Chad back in the day. And so you said you were working for energy policy too? What was the energy policy?
Oh, no, I think I said I had worked since 1973 on energy policy. And in the course of the period between 73 and today, I have worked for 4 different organizations, all national nonprofits with a focus on energy and or environmental work, but they all overlap in terms of their agenda, and they often overlap in terms of the staff that I work with.
Uh-huh.
So I've been on a continuum for the past 50 some years, except for a 3-year stint in Peace Corps in Ukraine, where even there I was working on environmental and energy policy work.
Wow. Okay. And that's Ukraine. That's where Chernobyl is.
That's correct.
Yeah. I actually knew some people that had a kid and they were living near Chernobyl and they immigrated. They're sort of like nuclear refugees. And he had some like defects, their son did, from that fallout there. And I think some people in Europe still, maybe is it like in parts of Germany or something, they were telling me that they can't eat mushrooms or something like that because of that Chernobyl fallout, which is kind of scary,
When I joined Peace Corps, the Peace Corps staff advised all the American volunteers, as you suggested, to not purchase wild mushrooms or for that matter, a variety of wild vegetables and fruits because of potential contamination from the Chernobyl fallout.
Oh, wow. So you were there after that happened. I don't remember what year it was.
Chernobyl was 1986.
Oh, so you were there after 86.
Yeah, I was there from 2000 to 2003.
Okay, great. That sounds like a good experience to be in the Peace Corps too. You said you started doing this in 73 and Earth Day was founded in 70. Were you at the first Earth Day?
Well, there was no one location for Earth Day. Earth Day was hundreds, if not thousands, of events around the country.
Okay.
I was a college student in 1970, and yes, on my college campus, I played a small role, and I want to emphasize small, in Earth Day activities that year on my campus.
So you have been participating in Earth Day activities since the very first Earth Day.
Correct.
That's pretty neat. Yeah. That's a long time. Well, thank you for all that you've done.
I'm sure there are many others who have done far more than I have. I stand on, as they say, the shoulders of giants.
All right. Well, thanks for being modest. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSEAN, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. So how do people, subscribe to what you're doing and just learn more about what you're doing or follow you and all that kind of stuff? And we'll put some links in the show notes.
The easiest thing, if people want to receive information from us, is simply send an email and we'll put them on our mailing list. And we have several mailing lists, so we can give people a choice of what kind of information they want. We publish a couple of weekly newsletters. Each week we put out 1 or 2 reports. Twice a month approximately we put out press releases. So depending on what people want, we can put them on the appropriate list. And the easiest way to contact us is by email, and our email address is sun-day-campaign@hotmail.com.
So sun-day-campaign@hotmail. Okay, great. So everybody get on the list. And how about any other things? So I'm looking right now, it looks like something about Twitter or X.
Twitter we have actually suspended due to its affiliation with its founder, its current owner, I should say.
Okay, so
we are going to shift over to Blue Sky very shortly.
Okay, so you didn't have a problem with Jack, the original founder of Twitter.
No.
Yeah, I actually live in the Bay Area, and one of my friends is one of the first employees of Twitter, and he did pretty well. I remember when he first told us, he was probably in his early 20s, and he's like, I'm working for some company called Twitter. And we're like, that's a stupid name, And then we're like, oh yeah, that was my friend Jeremy's company. We've been hearing about that for a long time. And how about other places, or is there a website?
We had one and we took it down. It's going to be up again sometime in the second half of this year. But we don't have an address I can give you at this point. So
sun-day-campaign@hotmail.com. That's where to find out about the Sunday campaign. Great. Okay. And Ken Bossong. Let's see, is there any other things that we want to cover and talk about right now?
Well, something I'd like to mention, because most people this comes as a surprise, is how significant a role renewables are playing now in U.S. energy supply. One of the things we've done fairly recently is we've analyzed the most recent data from the federal government, and that's primarily data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And very broadly, about a third of our electricity and about a third of our generating capacity today is coming from the mix of renewables. A lot of critics of renewables will say, well, solar is only providing maybe 1% of our electricity, which is not correct. In March alone, it's close to 10%. And that's solar alone. If you include wind and the other renewables, hydropower, geothermal, and biomass, it's almost a third of our electricity is now coming from renewable energy sources, and it's growing rapidly. It's growing far more rapidly than any fossil fuel or nuclear power. And we expect that it will this year produce more electricity. Meaning solar will produce more electricity than hydropower. This year, solar and wind combined will produce more electricity than coal. Solar and wind combined again will produce more electricity than nuclear power. And the mix of all 5 renewables will produce roughly the same amount of electricity, at least this spring, as natural gas.
That's great. And another thing too is that you see the new installed capacity. Like if you combine the renewables or just, solar, wind, and storage, we're pretty close to 100% of the new electricity that's going on the grid.
That's correct. For the first 3 months of this year, which is time period for which we had the most recent data, 98% of all new generating capacity was either solar or wind. Mostly solar, secondarily wind. There was none from coal, very, very, very little from natural gas, and none from nuclear.
Yeah. And so I think another positive thing is nobody's going to stop this. We've got the momentum. We're it's the least expensive form of electricity. It's like they can make policy changes that will make some little ups and downs and what they call the solar coaster. But anything that is growing as fast as renewables have been growing for the last 20 years or so, in the next 20 years, is going to have some ups and downs on its way up. You don't see anything that's a disruptive technology have a nice, smooth, up. I imagine when they were switching from, horses to cars, there was probably people stressing out like, oh no, they just made another rule for horses, something. Nothing against horses, renewable energy.
Well, since you mentioned rules, I think the only serious impediment to solar and wind in the near future are administrative roadblocks put up by the Trump administration and perhaps the Republican Congress. In terms of cost, in terms of technology, the renewable energy industry is going to be continuing to grow very rapidly, at least outside of the United States. But even here, even with administrative roadblocks, the costs are so competitive that I have no doubt solar and wind will continue to grow.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. They're going to build something else and they need quick, fast energy. And then I always like to zoom out too. And you think of there's the Trump. Well, we had a Trump administration before, and actually solar and wind grew fast. And everybody said it wasn't going to, and it did. And he made a lot of stories about how he's going to do coal and all this kind of stuff. And it's just there's momentum. It's financially, it's what we need. And, it's like if you want to use some old technology that's more expensive and you're going to go build a coal plant, by the time they get that thing built, we're going to have another, administration in there that's going to promote solar again, things like that. And it's not just another administration too. There's going to be elections coming up in a year and a half, and they're going to, the House might change, the Senate might change. That's kind of the way that our politics work. And I think a lot of times too, presidents, they shout a lot, but they don't make all the rules. So,
fortunately, that's true. We're already seeing, even in the first 100 plus days of the Trump administration, some perhaps second guessing. As you and your listeners may well know, shortly after he became president, Trump tried to stop the offshore wind farm being built in New York State. And within a matter of weeks, they had to reverse course. And so that wind farm, which is called the Empire Wind Farm, and which is about 800 megawatts, roughly the size of a nuclear power facility, should be coming online, along with a even larger facility offshore near the coast of West Virginia. And this is in spite of active hostility by the Trump administration to offshore wind. The economics are just so compelling that those projects and others just will continue to move ahead. The only question is how fast, if not if.
Yeah, and sometimes I even wonder with politics and things it could be that he had no plans on stopping it. He just wanted for his supporters to make it sound like he was against it.
It's hard to say, but as the expression goes, you can't stop an idea whose time has come.
Yeah, that's a good one. Do you know who came up with that? I know I've heard it before.
No, I don't.
Okay, well, somebody does. Great. So let's see. So any other topics?
Not that I can think of. I think we've sort of touched on the basics of where we stand. I suppose the only challenge if talking about renewables or renewables and storage is these technologies are working very well and growing very rapidly in the electricity sphere. You still face major challenges in the non-electricity sphere, such as transportation fuels, heating, raw materials for production of things like fertilizer. There, fossil fuels still dominate, and some of the work of the former Biden administration was looking at alternatives, renewable energy alternatives in those fields. That work will probably come to a halt during the Trump administration, and so we still have that challenge ahead of us. And unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of time because of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess too, like, it makes our country less competitive with the other countries that are going to develop this. Like, all those things, probably like China or somebody is working on all of what you just mentioned with, like fertilizer and transportation and all that kind of stuff. So at least somebody's doing it. It is like we do share an atmosphere with all those different places. I kind of think if we don't do the solar and do the storage and do the wind like we could, we're going to be less competitive in AI, robotics, and all of these important things that make the world economy go. And I think, too, that the businesses that have been supporting Trump are going to be telling him, hey, we need to keep moving with this low-cost energy that comes from solar and wind so we can be competitive and so our businesses will work. Sometimes I just think that, like what you said, you can't stop an idea whose time has come, and the time is now, and I don't think it's going to be stopped.
And you make a good point. Trump and his Republican allies in the Congress may be hostile to renewables. However, as you suggested, many big businesses do understand the economics of renewables and why that's the best choice for them. And roughly half the states are what we would call blue states that are continuing to move ahead aggressively on promoting renewables. So between large businesses and at least many of the states, and that includes, by the way, some Republican states, because Texas, for example, is, along with California, the leading state for wind, solar, and storage. And they recognize the economic advantages of those technologies. So regardless of what may be coming out of Washington, D.C., there's an impetus on the local level and in the corporate world to continue moving ahead with these technologies.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ken Bossong, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. I enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, and let's talk again sometime. And thank you for your service, not just in the Peace Corps, but from being at that first Earth Day on your college campus and being an Earth Day organizer all the way back to 1970 and perhaps even before that. I imagine you were probably doing things back when you were in college and making a big, huge difference in the world. I'm sure that making that difference also gives you a warm glow feeling inside. You might have learned about that when you were in college back in those days in your philosophy class, doing things for that selfish, warm glow feeling of making the world a better place. Just kind of kidding about the selfish part. Yeah, it's been really fun talking to you. Like a lot of times with the podcast, I like to get people on that are like part of history. And I think that you are part of history. So thanks for being part of the solar industry and making solar more competitive and bringing that out there for other people. And then also just, by the way, is with this podcast, I support it by my only advertiser is my own training. And if you do some of my training, like my classes on heat spring, or hire me to come in or do some consulting for your company, wherever it may be in the world, it will make you more competitive, you, the listener, as far as being able to compete in the industry and get a great solar job so you could be somebody that makes the world a better place, like Ken Bossong. So thank you so much for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Check it out on SolarSEAN.com. Woo!